And I was given the title, The Invisible Arbiter, Understanding Conscience and How It is Protected in Law. And what I would like to do tonight is go through this in 4 parts. I will start with an introduction where I'm going to give you some very concrete examples of where people in real life were faced with that dilemma. And then after that, I will go into the question of more the definition. What is in fact conscience? And how do we understand it? And then thirdly, I'll go briefly into conscience and the law. Where do we stand in the legal framework within which conscience, freedom of conscience, is protected? And then finally, in the 4th part, the conclusion, I would like to give some ideas of how the future looks like and what our responsibility there is. I'd like to start today with a quote by a great Jewish thinker who is an Auschwitz survivor. And in a beautiful book where a number of interviews are published, he says the following, and I think it's good to start with this quote and let it sink in so you understand the depth of the issue we are dealing with. He said, "In Auschwitz, it became clear to me that education is often only a thin layer on the soul. In extreme situations, only the well-formed heart remains." This is so true. And in fact, what he describes here is human conscience. Conscience is not just a theological or a philosophical concept. This is probably also one of the reasons why tonight we don't have 500 people here. Because people think, well, this philosophical, theological concept doesn't really have anything to do with real life. So why should I be worrying about that? Let the academics do that. But no, that's wrong, because it's really very concrete. And I'm going to give you 5 examples. I'm going to give you examples of 2 soldiers, of 2 politicians, and then as a result of that, how these people inspired me in a very concrete situation, so that you also see that also for me, it is not a theory, but something very concrete. The 2 soldiers I would like to dwell on with you a little bit are Father Christiaan Goldman and, Paul already mentioned him, my favorite, Franz Jägerstätter. Because the interesting thing is, Father Christiaan Goldman and Franz Jägerstätter were both soldiers in the Second World War. Father Christiaan, a German soldier in the German Wehrmacht. Later, he was even drafted into the SS. And Franz Jägerstätter, of course, a soldier, an Austrian farmer who was drafted also into the Wehrmacht. Then I would like to discuss with you my great inspiration and saint, Saint Thomas More, and somebody who's little known to most people, King Baudouin of Belgium. So let me speak to you about these 4 people. But before doing that, I'm going to give you 2 introductory thoughts so that you will also be able to really interpret well the biographies of these people. 2 points. Ultimately, and this is something we often forget, ultimately adherence to our conscience can come down to just one moment, one single decision in life. This is another misunderstanding about conscience, about some great stand you're going to take in a situation and, speaking. No, often it's just one short, brief moment that probably not even anybody sees. This is important to realize. And the second one, and think about that as I go through the examples of these lives, my conscience is not yours. My conscience is not yours. In fact, Thomas More says something very important about that before I speak about his biography. Thomas More says, "I meddle not with the conscience of them that think otherwise. every man, his own master, stands or falls with that. I am no man's judge. Why is this so important in understanding the examples I'm going to give you? Because especially today, where in the absence of a transcendent order and the rejection of human conscience, we get instead a moralizing society that is constantly moralizing. If you don't think like me in regard to climate change, you are a bad person. If you don't think like me in relation to COVID measures, you are killing your grandma. So we've come into this situation where we are constantly moralizing because of that absence. But that also means that we don't understand your conscience is not my conscience. So keep those two thoughts in mind as I go talking briefly about these four people. Let's start with Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More, 16th century, he was anything that anybody could ever wish in politics. He was the Speaker of the House of Commons. He was an important judge. He had all sorts of advisory positions to the king. And finally, he was what we would say today, the Prime Minister. So really the second in charge after the king himself. So really the highest office of the land, Sir Thomas More got. But he was also a devout Catholic. And he was a father of 4 children, married. He was an avid reader. He had actually a little chapel on his property where he would pray. He wrote many books. He was really somebody who knew his stuff, so to say, who knew his faith. And then comes the moment that King Henry VIII, I hope many of you have seen A Man for All Seasons, a fantastic film that describes his life. Then comes King Henry VIII, who first wants to divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and who then wants to remarry, and then also later wants to make himself head of the church in England. I think you all know the story a little bit. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. But Sir Thomas More, Saint Thomas More ultimately, at the end of the day, had to decide on the basis of his conscience on 2 things. King Henry VIII wanted the Pope to declare his marriage to Catherine of Aragon invalid. But the Pope didn't go along with that. So King Henry VIII, who had great trust in Thomas More, actually wanted him, as others, to acknowledge his marriage to Anna Boleyn. And later, he also wanted to, through an oath actually, that Sir Thomas More would accept that he was the head of the church. Both things Thomas More refused. But he did it wisely. He didn't make a big scene. In fact, he never said anything until he was literally forced to do so during his trial. Before that, he kept quiet. He resigned his office. He didn't want to create any scandal. And the long story short is that finally, because he was not willing to go against the church and against the sanctity of the sacrament of marriage and the primacy of the Pope as the head of the church, he was finally beheaded. A quote from St. Thomas More to put all this in perspective. What does he say about conscience? I have a beautiful book that I was gifted by a friend, and it has all the trial texts, all the original trial texts of the trial of St. Thomas More. And in one of the interventions, when he was being interrogated during the trial, although it was a real show trial, because of course the verdict was already known before the trial started, he was asked about his conscience. And he was given the typical argument that we hear through the lives of all these four people we're going to be discussing. But everybody does it. But everybody says it. He says, I answer that there is a much greater obligation on the part of a good man and faithful subject to consult his own conscience and eternal salvation, and to follow the prescription of reason than to take account of any other thing, especially since the kind of conscience that I have offers no offense to its prince and stirs up no sedition. And it's very interesting because you were speaking, Paul, about the movie A Quiet Life, or A Hidden Life, sorry. And when I was watching that movie, it was almost if I was watching the life of St. Thomas More. It's so similar. That shows a great truth about conscience. So what St. Thomas More says, there is nothing more important than your own conscience and eternal salvation to follow, no matter what people say. Let's go to the next person. King Baudouin of Belgium. St. Thomas More, the quote I just gave you is from 1535, almost 500 years ago. King Baudouin of Belgium is 1989. King Baudouin of Belgium, married without children. He and his wife, Queen Fabiola, could unfortunately not have children. He was brought into a very difficult situation that I'm always surprised how few people know about this. In 1989, the Belgian parliament decided a law that was going to further liberalize abortion. And King Baudouin, who was a devoted Catholic, knew in his conscience that he could not sign that law. Like in all constitutional monarchies, a law only enters into force when the head of state, in this case the king, signs the law. So although the king has no political power, his signature is constitutionally still needed for a law to come into force. And King Baudouin knew in his conscience that he could not sign this law. But if he would refuse to sign the law, it could mean that he might have to abdicate, or actually that he would be removed from his office as king. And there was enormous pressure put on him what he should be doing and how he should actually find a way around it. And everybody will understand that you don't mean it, and all other countries have it, all the arguments that were known. And this is what he says. I set out alone with my conscience and God. Here he says something important again. That's why my earlier comment on your conscience can be just a brief moment, a moment that nobody sees or hears or even realizes. And that's exactly what he says here. When it comes down to following your conscience, you are alone. And King Baudouin, the king, the most powerful man apparently of a country, says, I set alone. I set out alone with my conscience. And then he said to his ministers, to his cabinet, the following: the Pope himself will not even change my decision. That's quite something. So what happened is, in fact, King Baudouin abdicated. But Belgium so much loved him that after 3 days they begged him to come back. And he was reinstalled as king. And in the meantime, they signed the law in another procedure or some parliamentary procedure. But as he clearly says, he set out alone. It's important to realize that. Again, also, this is the other reason why it's so important that you realize that my conscience is not your conscience. The third person, Father Gereon Goldman. Father Gereon Goldman was a Franciscan friar and later priest who, at the beginning of the Second World War, he was a German, absolutely wanted to be a seminarian and become a Franciscan friar and priest, which he later also became. But like all men, he was drafted into the German army. And it's interesting here, if you listen to this example, again, underlining my conscience is not your conscience, because the next example of Franz Jägerstätter is the other way around. Why? Father Christiaan Goldman was drafted. He went and served because on the basis of his conscience, he felt called to serve ultimately first as a seminarian and as a priest in the German army, however, refusing to ever handle a gun and kill anybody. So it's unbelievable if you read those two stories next to each other. Both, by the way, are fantastic books. Father Christiaan Goldman has written a book. It's written both in German and in English. It's called Under the Shadow of His Wings, where he describes unbelievable his story of what happened. He was even drafted into the SS, and he was sent to officers training. And this is what happened at officers training, because everybody who knows history a little bit knows that the Nazis first wanted to get rid, as they said, of the communists. Their next target was the Catholic Church. This is often forgotten. Christianity is something the Nazis wanted to get rid of after they had gotten rid of the communists. So officers who went into officers training actually had to disavow their Christian faith if they were, when it came to the SS. So Christiaan Goldman refuses. And there is an interrogation with the responsible officers, etc. And he's with a group of another group of seminarians. And this is what he answers to the senior officer who's interrogating him. Do you really wish to make an officer out of a man who is disloyal and traitorous to his God? For if a man will betray God, he will surely betray man. Very powerful. After this, they left him alone. They tried again later. Later, all the other seminarians in his group, in fact, somehow disavowed. They all ended up dead later. He was actually thrown out of the SS and sent back to the Wehrmacht, and he survived the war, ultimately. So here again, you see, my conscience is not your conscience. Finally, I come to Franz Jägerstätter. This is 1943. Franz Jägerstätter, you already told the story. He was a simple farmer, married with 3 young daughters in Austria, and he was also drafted into the army. He was drafted once, he was drafted twice, and by the intervention of the local priest, he could go back because he was a farmer, and finally he was drafted for a 3rd time, by which time the war was already in full swing in 1942, and he was convinced that this was an unjust war and that he could not participate in it. And he refused to serve under arms, but again, he said, I'd be very happy, well, not happy, but I would be willing to do other service in the army, for example, carrying brancards, carrying the sick, taking care of the sick, but that was not allowed to him, and he was refusing to actually swear the oath to Hitler. Finally, he was imprisoned and tried in another show trial, and also on the 9th of August 1943, he was beheaded. This is what Franz Jägerstätter writes. From prison, one of his last writings. Even if I write them with my hands bound, these words, it is still better than if my will were bound in chains. No dungeons, nor chains, nor even death are able to separate one from the love of God, to rob him of his faith and his free will. It's very important at this point to realize we have here two soldiers, one a priest, one a farmer, and they all follow their conscience, but in a very different way. Father Gideon was convinced that he should not refuse to be in the army, because actually as a priest, and his book describes it wonderfully, how many souls he has saved by being there as a priest in uniform, administering the last rites to dying soldiers in his company. Whilst Franz Jägerstätter was called to a different way to follow his conscience, by actually refusing, although offering to be in a non-violent function, and finally, literally losing his head over it and being beheaded. This shows my conscience is not your conscience. Finally, to wrap this up, to also show to you that also for me personally, this is something very concrete and not a theological or just a theological or philosophical concept. In 2020, in fact, that was the time that I was reading the biography of Franz Jägerstätter. I was reading it, especially during those Corona years. And in 2020, I was president and rector of ITI Catholic University. And I still remember that time in March 2020 when the first lockdown started and we were all forced to close universities and schools. And we all forced to go online. And I will never forget one image that really called to my conscience and to follow it. One day I was teaching a class online, and there was one student in the audience, because of course I had the screen with all the students there. And there was one student in the audience, I will never forget him. He had red hair, and he was sitting in a dark garage with, all sorts of rubbish around him. It was a garage where they would just store whatever. And I could see the face of this young man, deeply lonely, unhappy, completely not at the right place. That's the moment, inspired by these men, that I decided I can no longer, as long as I'm a rector of this university, I can no longer participate in this injustice that is being done to these young people. And I have two of my colleagues sitting here. I don't know if you remember, but soon after I called a team meeting and I said, as long as I'm presiding over this university, we are no longer going to participate in these lockdowns, and we're going to find a correct and legal way to make sure we reopen. And so we did. At the end of April, beginning of May 2020, we reopened, and we were the only university in the whole of Central Europe that remained completely open for in-person education until the end of the Corona crisis. And it was the example of these men, because it was really for me a matter of conscience, because I was responsible for the education of these young people. And I could see how their lives were withering through that. So it's always this one moment. And we have to be ready for that moment. And that is why it is so important that we also let ourselves inspire by the examples of these four people. And there are many other examples, of course, by their examples, because they show us what it takes and when we have to be ready. Let's now move to the second part. I hope I've sufficiently shown you how concrete the question of conscience is, as the title says, the silent arbiter. Let's now start to unwrap a little bit what the definition and understanding is. I'd like to give you 3 points to define what conscience actually is. The first one is, it is the voice of nature and reason, rooted in God the Creator, that speaks to us on what is right and just and what is not. It leads us to speak or act, or not to speak and act. But the key words here, it's the voice of nature and reason as rooted in God the Creator. And for those people who do not have a religion, this definition goes as well. Because it's the voice of nature and reason rooted in our Creator. It's something that we know deep inside us. Deep inside us, we have this understanding of what is right and what is not. And it should always lead us to conclude and then decide to speak or act or not. This is the first one, the voice of nature and reason, rooted in God the Creator. Second, this is where most people go wrong. They say, oh, it's my conscience. Sort of, this autonomous thing that has nothing to do with the world outside. No, wrong. Because human conscience, in order to be effective, requires a lifelong process of formation through learning, instruction, discussion, debate, to be ever better understood and applied. This is, and I'll come to speak about that later, this is why censorship is so problematic. Because we can only form our conscience if we are informed, if we have in front of us on the table all the issues that matter, and that we have the opportunity to debate them and to say, well, that doesn't look right to me. That argument needs to be further discussed. We need to have another look at that, etc. This is an ongoing process. Our conscience is never fully formed. It's a lifelong, humble lesson in realizing again and again and starting anew and making new steps. But that requires community, that requires debate, that requires discussion. So vital. And thirdly, the third part of the definition, it is deeply personal and relational and informed by experience. It's personal and relational. You cannot form your conscience alone. It always happens in community, as part of a nation, as part of wherever you are, in your family. Obviously, the family is the first place where the conscience is formed, but also your church community, you name it, and also experience. This was one of the other things that was really very disturbing for me, again, in the Corona time, how human experience was suddenly pushed away. It was not relevant anymore. It was only what certain scientists said, but human experience was gone. But human experience is part of forming our judgment, forming our experience. And here then comes in to top this third element of the word encounter. I always like to say that the most important word of the papacy of Pope Francis was the word encounter. Encounter means much more than dialogue. Encounter means I actually go sit at that table across from you. I'm going to look you in the eyes. I'm going to get to know you as a person. I'm going to appreciate you as a person. I'm going to see that person, the human being, for who he or she is. And only then, from that position of seeing the dignity of the other human being across from the table, only then am I going to discuss whatever issue we have to discuss. That's encounter. In forming our human conscience, that encounter, and that's why I speak about personal and relational, that encounter is vital. We need to have this constant encounter to really, as human beings, be able to live with each other, but also to form our conscience. So these are the three, I would say, defining elements of what human conscience is. Important note here to make. My Christian faith, my Catholic faith, is itself not the source of my conscience. Now, you might be shocked if I'm saying that. It is rather what awakens my conscience. The church teaches me to see what is already there planted in my being and to implement it. This always reminds me of the famous words of Pope Benedict XVI when he gave his speech at the German parliament in 2011. And I quote these all the time because for me it's the greatest speech ever given by a pope. In it he says, other than the other monotheistic religions, Christianity doesn't impose upon society a revealed order. Instead, it points to nature and reason as the sources of law and organizing society, obviously knowing that they are rooted in objective reason of God the Creator. But it's fascinating that he says it there. And never forget, this speech was so well received in the parliament. But there he brings it to the point. That's why I am saying my Christian faith awakens that in me. But we have to understand that it's there. Our church takes us by the hand to understand that, to see it. And here's another reason why that is so important. My conscience can only act as urged, moved from within, not by whatever comes from without. That can merely be an inspiration. This is why I always get very comfortable, for example, when people ask me, oh, you're Catholic, so you must be against abortion, euthanasia. I'm like, no, that's not the reason why I'm not in favor of this. It's for very different reasons. It's because I respect the sanctity of life from the moment of conception. That is a matter of nature and reason to see that. It's not because the church tells me so. It's because there are perfectly biological arguments for that. So my conscience can only act as urged, moved from within. It's a decision I make. It's not something that I can have imposed from the outside, no matter how good or interesting or valuable that is. Therefore, there we come back to what we heard Franz Jägerstätter say, conscience and free will, inner freedom I call that, are deeply linked. Conscience and free will, inner freedom, are deeply linked. As a result, applying my conscience in a deliberate way means that is an inner act of freedom. It's a decision I make, a choice, a decision that only I can take or fail to take. It is my only absolute freedom. It is an act of the free will. Now, again, to assure you that this is not some nice philosophical, theological concept, let me quote the Soviet Gulag camps survivor, Walter Zizek, who suffered the most horrendous fate in all sorts of different Soviet concentration camps and prisons. He says, ultimately, the only absolute freedom we have resides in a man's free will. Our human conscience is an act of the free will. Let me move to the third part, and that is the legal perspective, conscience and the law. Where do we stand? I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's a rather dry part, but I do want to point out to you that in fact, the protection of the freedom of conscience is very deeply anchored in both the international and into European human rights systems. Of course, the most known one is Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And it then goes on to explain what that includes. This is repeated in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and in Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights. We also know from the case law of the European Court of Human Rights that it is generally, but not always, widely protected. Yet, as Paul already mentioned, we see it is also increasingly under attack. And the question is why? Why is that? And I want to give you two reasons for that. The first reason why it is increasingly under attack is because we reject the reality of human conscience in favor of power. We reject the reality of human conscience in favor of power. Whether that power is by majority rule or any other form of democratic or non-democratic powers. But the reality of human conscience is rejected. And I think you can all think of examples where we see that. Where somebody, whether it be a state institution, whether it be a large business institution, decides that this is what we have to think, or this is how we have to act, and there can be no further debate about it. And the power is used, the power that that institution has, is then used to force implementation of that. But there's also a second reason why we can see the freedom of conscience under attack. And that is that we misunderstand human conscience for an insular concept of self-fulfillment. And the tragic thing is that we often see a combination of these two, especially in our Western liberal democracies. Let me explain that second point a little bit more. We misunderstand human conscience for an insular concept of self-fulfillment. In a society as advanced as ours, where so much is possible, technology, medical science, all the advances we have made, we seem often to think that whatever we can do, we should do. And there then flow in all sorts of concepts of how I can fulfill myself better. That is a very known concept. That in combination with power tends to lead to problematic situations. And this then leads to what I call the rule of law that is based on nature and reason, turning into the rule of feelings. Because if everything is about self-fulfillment, and I use the institutions of society to not only allow my self-fulfillment, but actually to force it upon everybody around me, then the rule of law becomes the rule of feelings, because it's whatever I feel or desire at this moment that then becomes the law of the lands. The problem with that is that feelings, opinions, and preferences are not rooted in human conscience, but they are mostly rooted in the emotional sphere, in passions. And I'll give you an example of that. And I'm really sorry that I keep coming back to this period of 2020 to 2023, because unfortunately it's a period that we have not evaluated sufficiently yet. It's still a taboo. We're still not really willing to talk about it. But I think we should, because there's a lot we have to learn from it, from the mistakes that were made. The primary response of our society that believed it had become master over the creation and master over the earth through all the technological and medical advances, the primary reaction when a small little virus came that we didn't know before, our first reaction was fear. Complete and utter fear. From that moment on, governments and institutions in society started reacting and responding on the basis of that very primordial emotion of fear. and started to base its policies on that. And this then led to measures in which the, so to say, active involvement of human conscience to discern whether the impact of such measures would really be appropriate and proportionate were shoved aside, because this fear was, we have to control this virus at any cost, doesn't matter what. And we closed schools and we closed societies. And we all know the lasting impacts this is having on people. This is because, as I write in my 2024 essay, Friends and Enemies of Human Conscience, is that the modern man considers itself a superior homo technicus. It does not consider humanity beholden to anything else than itself and the laws, institutions, and applications it has built. If they are threatened, anything goes. And of course, we've seen that. It's very interesting because in any situation of crisis, obviously a government needs to intervene. Obviously, a government needs to take measures. I'm not doubting that. That also needed to happen in the corona times. Absolutely no question about it. But the fact that those measures, those reactions were basically only guided by fear made them problematic. Not the fact that measures need to be taken, but the way in which they were inspired. If we feel that what we alone think as human beings we have built up, and the only thing that is valuable for us, the self-made man, if that becomes threatened, and that's what happened in that time, because there was something that we couldn't handle, that we didn't know where it came from or how it would respond or how it would affect us. Fear took over, and then because everything we had built up was threatened, suddenly anything seemed to be acceptable. That is, and that's why I'm spending so much time on going into this point, that is when law has the potential to become arbitrary, an instrument of power, and not an instrument of justice. Hannah Arendt, she's one of my favorite writers, political writers. And she is herself a survivor of the Holocaust. Much of her family got killed in the extermination camps. And in her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she writes something that makes this point of the arbitrariness of law very concrete. And I've used this quote often. I keep using it because it really points out where the problem is. She says, what she points out is that the moment as a society we lose the understanding of the transcendent, we fall into this temptation of arbitrariness. And she says it very well. And she writes this, mind you, in 1949. And she says that a conception of law which identifies what is right with the notion of what is good for, whether it be the individual, the family, the people, or even the largest number, becomes inevitable once the absolute and transcendent measurements of religion or the law of nature have lost their authority. And then she goes on to explain that if that happens in a society, one fine day, it is perfectly feasible to happen that by majority decision, a country, a society decide that it would be better for that society to exterminate one part of that society. And she writes it. And of course, she writes that on the basis of her experience of the Holocaust and of the experience of Soviet communism. Let's not forget that during the Nazi time, in the beginning years, most of the laws were passed by parliaments, by a parliament and by a majority. So, very important to realize the danger that when law loses its connection with the transcendent, that what goes above the merely human creations. And then we have moved from the rule of law to the rule of feelings to the rule of power. Human dignity then loses. I come to my conclusion. How does the future look like? And I would like to say that this depends first and foremost on each one of you, on myself, and on every human being who is willing to use their ability to think. So let me ask you a question to take home and reflect on. This is a serious question. Who will be the pastor and governor of souls? Your soul. Who will govern your soul? Who will be the pastor of your soul? Now, to make you understand why this question is important, I'd like to quote you from a legal scholar from the UK, McGrogan is his name, who says the following. Secularization appears increasingly to mean the replacement of church by state in quite literal terms, with the state presenting itself as the means for realizing a kind of temporal salvation, and the structure of government taking the form of a mechanism precisely for the management of the circulation of merits and faults. If we lose the respect for a pre-political order that goes beyond what we as human beings have created, then ultimately nothing else is left than that whatever institutions have the power at any given moment become the governors of souls. The question is, do you want that? Who will be the pastor and governor of souls? So, what is it? Is it totalizing business and government interests that very comfortably provide all, also what we should think, or how our conscience should look like? Or is it the daily exercised and trained freedom to think for oneself, whilst choosing how to respond to any given situation, rooted in a conscience and in community that is living by its ongoing learning? And I would like to close here with some words of our newly elected Pope Leo XIV, because he has in the past days been saying some very important things. Because, as I already mentioned before, there is an essential element in the formation of human conscience and the application of human conscience, and that is the art of listening. This is something we find increasingly important in the social media environment. Most people live in their cocoons, in their echo chambers, where they are only listening or reading to the same people who think the same thing. But they're not listening to other people who think other things, who come from other backgrounds. And Pope Leo has something very important to say about that. He says, I think it is important for all of us to learn how to listen more. And then the day after, he says, we strive for a different kind of communication, one that does not seek consensus at all costs, does not use aggressive words, does not follow the culture of competition, and never separates the search for truth from the love with which we must humbly seek it. Here he touches two important points. We increasingly live in the way we deal with each other in society, in this obsession with reaching consensus. It seems that consensus is the highest good, not the truth, not what is right and just, but just achieving consensus. And Pope Leo here rightly says that should not be the goal of communication. That goal lies much higher. So let's step away from that. And this is exactly the point, because if reaching consensus is the only thing that matters, then obviously there is no room for human conscience anymore. Because then you need to step aside from that, because we need to reach consensus. And the other thing, and ultimately the conscience is formed by that, we need to communicate with an attitude of love, together searching for the truth. So, what I would like to say as the really final word, it is really in our hands how human conscience continues to be, or not, the motor that should drive our societies. Thank you.
Christiaan, thank you so much for that really thought-provoking lecture. We've talked about it over the years. I read your essay last year, which gave me the idea to host this discussion this evening. And I want to start my first question really where you were finishing up, which is the relationship of individual conscience to the state ultimately, and how these two things sort of interact with each other. And I want to, before I ask the question, share a quick story, if I may. I was prompted thinking about it. It's about, I don't know, 18 years ago now, 15, 18 years ago. I was in the UK and I was about to go on a BBC radio debate. And the topic of the debate was a Christian couple who owned a very small guest home in their family home. And they had a policy within their home that they would only give double-bedded accommodation to married couples. They'd had this policy since the 1970s, no controversy. A same-sex couple wanted to take double-bedded accommodation. They politely declined. They were sued. They were taken all through the courts of the UK for following their conscience in their own home. And I was going on BBC to debate this topic. And the way it works is you when you're doing a radio debate is they bring you on a few minutes before you're meant to go on, and then you speak to the producer, and then they plug you in, and then you're there basically listening to whatever is being discussed before you then go on. And so as I was there, quite nervous, about to do this debate, the discussion that they were having before my debate was the members of parliament in the UK who had basically abused their personal expenses and were buying all sorts of outrageous things using taxpayer money to do this, including duck houses in their gardens. I mean, the list of things that people were buying was extraordinary and charging to the British people. And so the debate was how we can regulate members of parliament better, how we can create more and more regulation. Should we draft codes to say you're not allowed to buy duck houses in your garden and so forth? Anyway, the moment was very formative for me because I realized in that moment that on the one hand, in the UK, this elderly couple's conscience was being trampled over by the state. And on the other hand, those who pass laws in the UK were trying to pass more and more laws to regulate their own behavior. And I say all of that to say, is it the case that when individual conscience is sort of ridden over, what ultimately happens is more law, more regulation, ultimately more state power to control human behavior?
Well, the problem goes both ways, in the sense that when the state feels that it has to regulate more, it usually does that in response to certain behavior. And the problem with that is that, first of all, the problem lies clearly in our families and in our educational systems and in the public debate, that people are not formed, educated in a way that they would, in the first place, refrain from doing these things. But the other side of the problem is, in the other direction, is that more laws is not going to solve that problem. And that's the point I was making earlier. If it doesn't come from a movement within, if it's not an act of the inner freedom to decide to act or not to act in a certain way, then no laws can help. And the problem you're getting is, if a state starts over-regulating, it also undermines the rule of law in the end of the day. And I'm a lawyer myself, and so for me, the rule of law is absolutely vital to the society. But the more the state overregulates, the more, because we are as human beings born free, the more people are going to disregard it and thus undermine the system. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work because of these two reasons.
Yeah, Edmund Burke, who is always good for a quote, he said that the less a man is restrained from within, the more he must be restrained from without.
Right.
You know, the same point. And I personally think this is one of the great sort of overarching themes of the last 2-3 decades, which is more and more state power trying to regulate more and more areas of human behavior, because there is a lack of essentially self-regulation that comes. I want to read a quote, actually. I wrote it down ahead of time, but it fits perfectly, from Michael Novak. He wrote an essay in 1994 called Emerging Out of Nihilism. He won the Templeton Templeton Prize for this and gave an address in London. And he was essentially, the point he was making, very similar to what you're saying, Christiaan, is that in the 20th century, there was a great battle over, for example, political structures in Europe. There was a great battle over economic structures. And in the early 90s, the West felt triumphal in both of these areas. It felt it had won the argument over politics, over economics, but in the meantime had abandoned the third big battle, which was essentially morality. And had completely ignored that point. So Novak wrote in 1994, if a people composed of 100 million citizens is guarded by 100 million inner policemen, that is, by 100 million self-governing consciences, then the number of policemen on its streets may be few. For a society without inner policemen, on the contrary, there aren't enough policemen in the world to make society civil.
Mm-hmm.
How are we seeing that play out in terms of the overregulation, or trying to make society civil through the exercise of state power rather than the self-regulation of the human soul?
Well, first of all, I have to honestly say that I'm not particularly charmed by the term inner policeman he uses, because I think the problem, I understand what he means, but I think the problem with that is it misunderstands what conscience is, because the word policeman gives a little bit the idea that something is being forced upon you as somebody. But the whole point I was making, it needs to come from an inner freedom to decide that. And I think this is where we have the problem. And as always, we come back to education. The problem lies in the disintegration of families. The problem lies in the disintegration of marriages. The problem lies in our schooling system increasingly being taken over by whatever is the ideology of the day, rather than going back what is the basic role of a school to play. So since we are failing so much in the true formative ages of human beings, in the family, in the school, and we are increasingly denying, or maybe that's not the right word, ignoring what goes wrong there, then it comes out on the other side. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that there is this perceived need of more regulation and more laws, because obviously we see how many things are going wrong. You see that with, I mean, it's just unbelievable these days, what all sorts of ethics regulations that you have in business and in also in the political world, endless regulations and reporting mechanisms and you name it. I mean, the paperwork that has to come there. But for me, that's all a sign of poverty, of real poverty that is refusing to acknowledge the root of the problem. And the root of the problem lies somewhere completely else. And it basically confirms what you said with your quote. As long as we are not willing to look at the root of the problem and start working there, this will continue. And it will continue to be unsuccessful. I always find it very interesting, and I've used that example more often. I remember in 2008 when we had the big financial crisis, and the reality of greed came out, that it had so much to do with greed of people in the financial sector. And I remember people saying, oh, but how is that possible? They all had masters from Harvard and MIT and all these big business schools around the world. And I mean, those were the people who have had the most expensive education. How is that possible? Well, exactly, that's the point. Because they learned all sorts of skill sets at these expensive programs, but they were not trained sufficiently, and clearly also not in the preceding years, in the, so to say, what I would like to call human questions, in the ethical questions and the questions of human dignity. So we are really failing at that fundamental formational early stage. And by the way, it starts, for example, here in Austria, I hear that very often, people saying, ich gebe mein Kind in diese Schule. I give my child in this school. That already shows how far we have gone. Because that means I delegate my child to the school. They will take care of it during the day. And very often when both parents work, the children are in the school till 6 or till 5. I delegate my child to the school. That already shows that there's something wrong in our thinking. Because as parents, we should not be delegating our children to anybody. We have first and foremost ourselves the responsibility, because the parents are the first educators of their children. The school and the university and whatever, the church can help us and support us. So I'm saying this because for me, that's where the real problem lies.
No, it's really fascinating. I saw the most recent example that I had of this was just last week when party leader in the UK, Ed Davey, he launched a new campaign to introduce fines and bans for people who play their music too loudly on the train. Everyone gets annoyed by that, of course, but it's in my opinion, it's exactly indicative of what we're saying, that ideally what would happen is well-formed teenagers and adults would be told, be conscientious, think of others, respect others around you, and so forth. But instead, because there's a complete lack of formation, in steps in increasing regulation, and to the point where
in fact, sorry to interrupt you, I do that all the time. I very often, I take the train from Baden to Vienna every day, and very often you have people with their phones, not using earphones, playing, and I very often walk to mostly young people, and I very friendly ask them, can you please use earphones? And in 9 out of 10 cases, they respond respectfully. Yeah. And kindly say, oh, I'm sorry, or something like that. It only rarely happens that somebody answers aggressively. But that's, again, this is exactly the problem you're pointing out, Paul. because we have become so accustomed in these situations to let the state handle it. You know, new rules, new regulations. No, this is where civil responsibility comes in. This is where we have to educate each other.
Absolutely. Well, let's stay with the theme of politicians for a moment, because you've worked for so many years with leading politicians all around the world with your work with ICLN. And I don't want you to, I wouldn't dare to encourage you to breach any confidentiality, but I would love to know some of the insights that you have from all of the discussions you've had over the years, because of course politicians are in the position all the time where they're in a very important role, and then within the party, within the system that they're operating in, they are making compromises, political compromises. It's the nature of the job. And I would like to ask, how should people go about this fine balance between working in such instances, but then also making the stand when that one moment, as you put it, comes? What is the lesson for us to learn? How do we prepare ourselves for that one moment? How do politicians prepare themselves? How do we go about making good choices? It might not be the same choice for everyone. Like you said, my conscience is not yours, but how do we go about making good choices in those one moments?
I love this question, because this is one of the biggest topics that in my many discussions with politicians I deal with. And I would like to start with the lesson first, and then I will explain it a little bit more. What I've learned through all these years, and what I keep saying increasingly to political leaders, is this: the salvation of the world or of your country does not lie on your shoulders. What do I mean with that? I have so often heard people say in politics, if I don't vote for this bad law, or if I don't do this or that, I will lose my seat, or somebody else will vote for it, and then something much worse will happen. This is an argument that is often heard, and also especially Christians, I hear them say that very often. And I'm afraid to say there is an error of reasoning there, because let's keep this with Christians. If I die and I stand in front of God, I only have responsibility to give for my soul, for what I have done based on my conscience. I'm not responsible for what the guy who took my seat after me, or the guy or the woman who voted differently. That's not my responsibility. I'm only responsible for, taking care and keeping tidy my soul. And this is so important to understand, because if you look at the examples of Franz Jägerstätter, of Father Girion, of Thomas More, of King Baudouin, they all understood that. St. Thomas More actually says it literally, because he was being told by many, yes, but there are so many other Catholics who accept the marriage of King Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn, and there are so many others who accept that he's now the head of the church. And he said, that's their conscience, that's their responsibility towards God, but I have to take care of my responsibility. And this is so important, because this is where it often goes wrong. And that is when politicians try to separate their conscience, their personal convictions, from their political duties. It's often famously called leaving your principles and your convictions at the entrance of Parliament when you enter. Leave it in the cloakroom, and then you enter the hall. And I've often heard people say, my faith, that's my private affair, and nobody else has anything to do with it, and that's something different than my than my public function. But how does that work? I often ask myself and ask them, how does that work? Because if I let myself in my decisions be guided what others think or what others say I should think, how can I ever be faithful to do what is right and just? Ultimately, I can only be that when, from a formed conscience, I take the decisions that are based on principles that I hold dear. And which also means that I have to accept that holding these principles dear might actually cost me something. Franz Jägerstätter, I was just preparing for this talk today, I was rereading one of his last letters. And one of the arguments that Franz Jägerstätter often got, very understandably, is that people said, yes, but you can say the oath and sort of keep your hand behind and lie, because you have a wife and children. And you have to take care of them. And it's a very understandable argument. And I would never want to be in that position in which Franz Jägerstätter is. So I'm not sort of playing down the difficulty of that situation. But Franz Jägerstätter said, okay, so what does that mean for my wife and children? I have to do evil for their sake? I have to go against my principles and conscience for their sake? Am I really helping them with that? And this is where it goes wrong in politics. And ultimately, that comes down to one term I like to use: the unity of life. You cannot be two persons. You are either a person who believes in A, B, and C and has principles A, B, and C, and you act accordingly, whether it's at home or at work or in politics or wherever, or you have to live a schizophrenic life, which then breeds chaos in society. So it's absolutely difficult. I cannot say that enough. I work long enough with politicians that I know what a challenge is, what a challenge it is. But what I can say is that those of them who have been very consistent in that have been very effective in ways unexpected. Let me just give one small example. It's a long answer. I find it always the most beautiful example. One of my role models is Lord David Alton. I'm sure you know him, and many of you would know him. He's a member of the House of Lords. And he is a very principled man. And when he was a member of the House of Commons, the British Parliament, for the Liberal Party, or the Liberal Democratic Party, they always had the opportunity to actually do a member's bill. And that could be any topic. And so he decided to introduce a member's bill to protect unborn life. And his party got so angry that they made it party policy to do exactly the opposite, to fully liberalize abortion. So he was in front of a choice. He had to make a choice. So he decided not to stand for re-election again in the party because he knew that he could not support this. So he lost his seat. 2 or 3 years later, by complete surprise, he is proposed by the Prime Minister at that time. He's proposed to the Queen to be appointed as a lifelong independent peer to the House of Lords, where he sits until today and is one of the most effective legislators I've ever met. He has not given 1 inch of his principles, and he's a voice for human rights, for religious freedom, and you name it. And I find it such a beautiful example because it shows it requires courage, it requires pain at times, but ultimately, always good comes from it.
Amen. And as of 2 months ago, he now sits as chair of the
Exactly.
all-parliamentary group on human rights, which is one of the most influential positions in the parliament. And yeah, exactly as you finished there, if I may add to your fantastic answer, it's almost like there's a second failure of logic in the sort of the answer that someone might give when thinking of compromise, moral compromise, which is to not allow room for God to act,
right?
To step in, to vindicate,
Exactly.
to act.
And by the way, not to misunderstand me, compromise itself is not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Compromise is part of politics. Compromises need to be made. But there is a measure, there is a red line.
Yeah.
And that red line is what your conscience dictates to you. Under that red line, many compromises can be made. But that's the judgment every politician, but every human being has to make for him or herself every time such a decision comes in front of them.
Absolutely. We're going to turn to questions in just a moment. So I say that so that everyone is ready to engage in this discussion. But I will ask one more briefly, turning away from politicians, the regular Christian in Europe seeking to live out their faith, not make a fuss. Based on your experience in politics, in law, in education, what do you see either in the present or on the horizon that are particular challenges for Christians in 2025 and beyond in regard to faithfully living out their conscience versus the political, the moral, the legal orthodoxies of the current day?
I think our biggest challenge is that we lack courage. We're too afraid. We are not willing to burn our fingers, or as Pope Francis used to say, we're not willing to make our hands dirty. I think that's really the biggest problem, because what I have been seeing, through working with so many politicians, also many non-Christian politicians, is that ultimately the human soul is always looking for order and what is right and what is just. We just have to have the courage to formulate it in a way that people can actually begin to accept it as a valid argument. I want to give you an example. It has nothing to do with politics, but it's what until the day of today encourages me every day. I did, as you said at the beginning, I did my law studies at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. It's the oldest university of the country. It's also the most secular university of the country. In fact, it was founded as an anti-Catholic university in 1575. So it's the most secular university you can imagine. And I studied law there. I also became a member of the student fraternity, which itself couldn't be more secular. And it was very interesting. Thanks to what I've received from my parents, from my family, from my grandparents, it was always for me very clear that my Christian faith was and is paramount. And I made that known to my friends in a respectful way, who were all non-believers. I have never in all those years in any way had to put any water in the wine. It went as far as this. On Sunday morning, at 10 to 10, when I was still lying in bed, I would hear a knock on my door, and at least one, mostly two, of my housemates would say, "Christiaan, shouldn't you be in Mass? Mass is at 10. Oh no, I had it late last night. I'm going to the evening Mass. Christiaan, no excuses. Get out of your bed and go to Mass." I'm serious. And I have many other such examples. And the interesting thing is, I hear the same from my children in different ways. Now, I'm not saying it's always like that, but I dare say, if we are a little bit more courageous, and if we dare to be a little bit more transparent with what we stand for, I think so much more is possible.
Well, thank you.